Dr. K, as I'm sitting here listening to you, and I had asked you about, sort of this numbing effect that being on a short form platform or playing a video game is having on our brains. And I said, oh, well, it can be relaxing. Here's what I just realized in listening to you, that I definitely see that, I've got this like busyness throughout the day. My brain is always engaged. I'm running from one thing to the next. And scrolling on social media is a lever that I pull to turn the busyness off. But as I'm listening to you, I will be very honest, it's not relaxing. When I go outside for a walk and I don't have my phone on me, that is a very different state in my brain.
100%.
And so even calling it that I'm relaxing is me kind of succumbing to what's happening with tech addiction and the casual numbing that you're doing all day long.
All day long.
All day long.
All day long. It's beautifully said. So this is where there's a difference between numbing our negativity and relaxing, right? And that's what technology is really good at. There are some times where you're on technology and you do get some positive, right? So if I'm watching like cat videos, like I can genuinely laugh, right? So it does release dopamine. There can be some amount of relaxation. And I'm not anti-technology, by the way. I think it's just we need to understand what effect it's having so that we can compensate.
Yes.
But absolutely, this is what we see is a lot of numbing that goes on. And then what happens is people you'll notice that a lot of people who use technology have difficulty going to bed at night. Because once you stop the technology, what happens? There's a flood of mental activity. There's a flood of emotion. And then I have difficulty going to sleep. And since I'm not sleeping because my mind is running a mile a minute, what do? I pull out my phone. And once I pull out my phone, now my mind is relaxed a little bit, right? At least it's focused. It's not running in 1,000 different directions, solving 1,000 different problems that I can't actually solve right now anyway, because it's 10 p.m. at night. What am I going to do? So then I hop on my phone for half an hour and I wait till my exhaustion becomes so profound that it overcomes that emotional flooding before I go to bed.
Holy smokes. You just described every person that's listening.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Because I think we've all had that experience, and I will get a little bit later in our conversation. There's so many kind of foundational things I want to cover. I promise we will get to your recommendation for what the evening routine should look like. But I personally understand exactly what you're saying. You you shut the laptop down, you put your phone away, and there is that flooding of activity in your brain. And then it never fails. Calm yourself down by just scrolling back at your phone.
Absolutely, right? So I don't know if people are like this. I do this a lot where like even if I watch TV before bed, I will turn off the TV and then I'll pull out my phone.
Yes.
And then I'll even sometimes pull out my phone while I'm watching TV. And then it's like, well, hold on a second. What are we doing here? Like, what's the point of this? Am I trying to enjoy this show? Like, what's happening?
Well, Dr. K, what is happening? Like, what is happening in that moment? Because I do feel like there are so many of us that don't want to turn over 2 hours a night or more just to mindlessly scrolling. And, we were talking with Professor Adam Alter, who was saying that we're going to spend 20 years of our life on our phone. And when we hear that and we go, we want to stop, but what's actually happening in your mind? Is this a sign that you're addicted?
Sure. So let's define a couple of terms.
Okay.
So the first is like, what do we mean by addiction? So generally speaking, when we use the clinical term of addiction, we're talking about something that impairs your function. Okay. So when we say that someone is an alcoholic, how do I know if I have a problem? Basically, if it is causing problems in your professional life, in your personal life, social life, mental health or physical health, that's when we really think about this is an addiction. So the challenge right now is that we absolutely have things that are addicting, which have not quite reached a threshold for many people of impairment of function. So everyone struggles with addiction to their phone, but they're not quite failing out of college, or they're not, getting reprimanded at their job. They're able to have relationships. And that's what we're starting to see is that technology is squeezing itself, because if there's actually like a really negative consequence, it's easier to stop. So there's all kinds of stuff that's going on. It's absolutely shaping our behavior and taking control away from us. And there are all kinds of like innovations that are designed to do that.
Like what?
So biometrics or Face ID. So if you look at this, like this is really important to understand. So when I was in college, this was like early 2000s, and I was studying, I would get distracted when I was reading a textbook. And my distraction would last maybe 2 minutes. And then since I didn't have a phone at the time, that distraction only cost me 2 minutes. Then my mind wanders away and then it focuses back on the task at hand. Right now, if you get distracted, it will cost you an hour. So all you have to do is catch that impulse. If you just look at your phone and you have Face ID enabled, boom. So when you have that impulse, app developers are reducing the barrier between impulse and action. And they know that once you look at one post, you're stuck for 45 minutes. You will scroll. So now what they're trying to do is figure out if this person has a single impulse, how can I get them to the first video? Because then we've got them hooked. The fish has taken the bait. They're on the line now. So that's where what we're seeing is that the price of an impulsive distraction is becoming way higher. So I think teenagers spend somewhere between 4 and 6 hours a day on their cell phone. It's crazy, right? And how
I would
do you
think
spend
even more, honestly.
Yeah, that's average. So how does that happen? It's because they hook you for a few minutes and then you lose an hour.
And here's a question that I think it might sound dumb, but I really mean this. How do you know if you're addicted? And I say that because, I can stand there as a parent, Dr. K, and look at my 25, 24, and 19-year-old, all of whom have their phones in their hands, all of whom are cranked down with their neck scrolling. And as I'm yelling, guys, get off your phone, I got my phone in my hand.
Absolutely. So in a weird way, I'd say it's the wrong question because I think we get caught up in whether we're addicted or not addicted.
Okay.
How do you know?
What's the right question?
The question is, do you want to use your cell phone? Are you intentionally using technology in the way that you want to? That's the question. Right? So at the end of your day or at the end of your week, if you look back and you look at all of your technology use, are you happy with how that's working? Are you like, man, I'm so glad that I spent 2 hours and 10 minutes scrolling on TikTok at 11 p.m. on a Thursday?
No, I'm not happy.
So
I feel like a fucking loser that I'm turning all that time over to some dumbass app.
I don't care if you're addicted or not. The question is, do you want to change? Are you happy with your technology use, right? So we can answer the question, right? So if it impairs function, so if it's interfering with something, and fair enough, we'll talk about all those negative effects. So it is doing things like shortening our attention span. We're seeing a rise in the diagnosis of ADHD. We're also seeing a rise in the not diagnosis, but subclinical ADHD manifestations. So a lot of people, even if they don't have a diagnosis, they identify with having ADHD. And why is that? It's because technology does the attentional work for you. So this is where I know I'm going off on a tangent,
great.
But so when I'm reading a textbook, I have to force my mind to pay attention, which means that I'm actually strengthening this capability in the mind. So the mind, whatever you stretch and whatever you exercise is what gets better, right? So if I spend a lot of time, listening to music, my brain will actually do neuroplasticity, will get better at listening to music. So our brain requires, the more we practice focusing our attention, the better we will be at focusing. Now what happens is with things like short form content, we saw this a lot with short form content. They do all the hard work for you. Because if something doesn't hold your attention for 15 seconds, you scroll past it, right? So everyone is engineering content so that you are just like, you're sitting and someone else is driving. And so you don't have to focus on your phone. You don't have to force yourself to focus. It does all the focusing for you. So what started to happen with our attention is instead of taking the stairs, we're taking the elevator all the time. So we are deconditioning our minds, and then it becomes harder to focus.
Which is why you will stand in a grocery store line, and instead of just enjoying a moment where you're not doing anything, you have to look at your phone.
Absolutely.
Because your brain is being programmed and conditioned to need attention, to need something, to need stimulation. And it's happening to you in real time. If you're sitting here and you're contemplating the question, because you just said, don't ask if you're addicted. Ask, am I satisfied and happy with the way that I'm using technology?
That's the main question.
And if the answer is no, I am not. I am giving too much time. I'm spending too much money. I do not want to feel beholden to this thing. What are some of your top habits or strategies, Dr. K, to take control of the amount of time you are spending on your phone or gaming or on social media?
Great question. So I think there's two approaches.
Okay.
So a lot of people will say just uninstall.
Yep.
Oftentimes people will have this experience where it's like, okay, I uninstalled YouTube and then I installed TikTok the next day, right? So like people will just swap out apps. So this is where what I've sort of found is that there are underlying drivers of behavior, and then there are kind of environmental things.
Okay.
So let's talk about the environmental things first. The first thing that I would recommend is that you don't use your cell phone for the first, or any technology for the first hour when you wake up.
Okay.
Now, this is really important to understand.
Okay.
So what a lot of people don't realize is that you have a certain capacity for pleasure and behavioral reinforcement when you wake up in the morning. You have only a certain number of units of pleasure and behavioral reinforcement.
Got it. So if I have a cup of capacity for both pleasure and behavioral reinforcement, you're saying that when you wake up, that one cup is already full?
So our dopaminergic circuitry in the brain, in this part called the nucleus accumbens, basically this is what gives us a sense of pleasure and also reinforces our behavior. So the problem with dopamine is we wake up in the morning and our dopaminergic stores are full. So what happens is we have a reserve of dopamine. And if you want something with delayed gratification and your dopamine stores are high, you can work a lot, but then when you get the payoff, since you have a bunch of dopamine, you get a strong dopamine release, and then you feel really good. So the way that this works is like, I want y'all to think about this. So let's say I wake up first thing in the morning and then I work for 4 hours. And then what is the reward, the subjective reward that I feel after 4 hours of work? It's really positive.
Yeah.
Then if I use technology for 4 hours, it's kind of whatever. But if I use technology for the first 4 hours of the day, and then I try to go and do work.
You're not going to.
You're not going to. And even if you finish the same amount of work, you will not experience the same level of pleasure, because your dopamine has literally been depleted.
Got it.
So the way that I kind of describe this is, imagine that you have a lemon that is full of juice.
Yep.
So at the very beginning, when it's full of juice, a small squeeze gets you a lot of juice. But by the end, you have to squeeze a lot to get very little juice. This is how dopamine is in our brain.
So in other words, if you tap into technology and it invades your circuitry in your brain, it literally is like squeezing most of the juice out of the lemon first thing in the morning.
First thing in the morning.
And then that means that it's also going to impact your ability to do the work or to focus or to feel joy and all those things that normally, if you did those things first, you'd feel a sense of reward and joy for.
Yes. So technology is like a hard squeeze. So if we use it first thing in the morning, we squeeze the lemon really hard and we get all the juice out. And then you have nothing left to feel good about because all of your dopamine stores have been depleted.
So is this also leading to this intense rise in what we're seeing and what so many experts have come on to talk about, which is this chronic feeling of being disconnected from yourself, this feeling of autopilot, this feeling of stress in your day-to-day life, that, you know, the fact that you are squeezing the juice from your brain first thing in the morning, it leaves you with no reserves.
So all of those things are true, and each one has a separate neuroscientific mechanism.
Wow.
So let's do one at a time.
Sure.
And I'm going to try to keep it concise. I think we can do that.
Okay.
So first, let's remember with the dopamine, the issue is that if you engage in a dopaminergic activity at the beginning of the day, you don't have as much dopamine to reinforce and feel pleasure for other activities. That's like just how it works, right?
Okay.
So we're emptying our lemon at the very beginning. So then working on your resume or finishing your resume, there's nothing left. So you don't reinforce the behavior.
Gotcha.
This is what gets people so confused about why they're not motivated. And even when they move in the right direction, their brain is not getting a positive reinforcement to repeat that behavior because the brain is empty. There's no pleasure left to feel. And that's what'll happen. If you are on technology for 8 hours a day, you start working at 4 p.m., you won't feel exhilarated by 8 p.m., even if you do the same amount of work.
Well, I think this happens even if you spend 10 to 15 minutes in the morning.
Yes, that's because technology is a vice of a squeeze, right? So you get a lot of juice. You empty your lemon very quickly with technologies. Okay. Now let's talk about disconnection from the self.
Yes.
So this is fascinating. So if you look at disruptions in our sense of identity, what we know from studies on trauma is that when someone gets traumatized, there's this part of our brain called the corpus callosum, which connects our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. And people who get traumatized will dissociate. So they will feel disconnected to themselves. What we know is that dissociation happens in part because there is a decreased connection between the right and left hemisphere. So our left brain is logical, our right brain is emotional. That's somewhat true, actually. And so what happens is we divorce our emotion from our logic. So when someone is being, let's say, like abused or something like that, they will feel emotionally numb through the whole experience. That is a defensive mechanism. So the emotions are overwhelming. So we're dispassionately, this negative thing is happening. I don't feel anything. So they feel numb. So anytime you numb your emotions, your sense of identity goes with it. So this is what's really interesting is you can look at studies of people who have gender identity difficulties and even autism spectrum. And it's been hypothesized that one of the reasons why people on the autism spectrum are much more likely to be non-binary is because they actually have less emotional connection to themselves. So our sense of self is formed by emotional experiences. So if I ask you, Mel, who are you? What would you say?
God, I don't know.
Tell me about yourself.
Well, geez, I think you're so smart. I'm embarrassed to get the wrong answer. Tell me about myself.
There's no
I
wrong
am a 56-year-old married woman with 3 adult kids. Mm-hmm. My favorite thing in the world to do is to empower and inspire people. I love learning. I'm a super positive person. I'm curious about how to squeeze the most juice from my life.
Great. So we can pause right there. So what I want you to pay attention to, and everyone who's listening, is the statements that you made are about your emotional experience. So you mentioned that you're married, sure, is demographic, but I would venture that your marriage is a strong emotional part of your life.
Oh, my relationship with Chris is the most important thing
right?
in my life.
So, and then you talk about curiosity, you talk about love. If we go further, we'll hear about trials and tribulations.
Yeah.
Right? So if you literally look at the way that your sense of identity is built, it's a string of emotional experiences. Like my story is failing out of college, addiction, going to India, rising in some ways to the top of my field, right? So these are all emotional experiences. So our sense of identity, literally, if you ask people, who are you? It's our emotional moments that matter. That when I went through that divorce, that made me who I am. When I survived cancer, that made me who I am. When I ordered chicken salad for the 7th day in the row, that didn't make me who I am. There's no emotion with it.
I get this. And so basically, you see as a psychiatrist and an expert in gaming addiction, and that since tech and social media makes us numb, that is an experience lacking this emotional connection, which is what you need for a sense of identity.
Absolutely. When I work with these like gamers who, I'm 26. What have you been doing with your life? Well, since I was 18, I've been sitting at home playing video games. There's one element of emotion to that, which is I'm a loser. So that becomes their identity because they have no span of emotional experiences because the technology is literally numbing them out, right? And so once you don't have that emotional experience, like think about it. Like when your life is a haze of technology use, you don't become a person.
Well, I think that's what most people are, honestly. Like you wake up, you sleep with your phone, you look at your phone, you commute with your phone, you sit down at work, you're on Zoom, you're on email, you're constantly staring at a screen, you look at your phone when you leave, you sit at a table with your family, and half the people I see in restaurants are staring at their phones instead of talking to the people that are sitting there with them. You're sitting down in front of the TV, you're looking at a screen, you're also looking at your phone, you go to bed with your phone. Like I feel like there's a massive, massive state of disconnection that people are feeling right now. They're not calling it that, but that's what I'm sensing profoundly in my bones.
Yes. So let's understand that because you mentioned autopilot and identity. So now this is where autopilot comes in. So once I'm not connected with myself, what prompts my behavior? What prompts my motivation?
More numbing. Like the same thing. You're just sort of on this like...
Absolutely. So that's why we become autopilot. Why do we become autopilot? Because there's no signals.
I just got something. And then on top of it, because you need some level of force or some action to be able to take a different type of action, put the phone down, get outside and go for a walk, because you have allowed technology to invade your brain and squeeze all the dopamine juice out of your brain, you don't actually have that will within you.
Absolutely.
To take the action.
Perfect. Right? So what happens is we numb ourselves to our identity. And what is it that prompts us to do something with our lives? It is our sense of identity. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a good person. I want to empower other people. I want this. right? So we lose connection with our internal self. So then what happens is normally what happens in a healthy identity is I have internal drivers and that gets balanced with the outside world. The world expects this of me. This is what I want to do. There's a healthy conflict there. Now what's going on is we are numbing ourselves to the internal. There is no internal anymore, which means we become autopilot. What does autopilot mean? This means that my actions, my behaviors, my desires, my goals are actually being conditioned in my mind. I watch this kind of social media, I think I need a thigh gap. I watch this kind of thing, I need to get this kind of thing. I need to have a side hustle, right? I need to do this now. So now what happens, and then we feel like we're not in control of our lives because we have all of these goals that social media is feeding us. And then we get super confused. Should I do this or should I do this or should I do this? The reason you're confused is because none of it is coming from you. One day this person is telling you this thing. The next day someone is telling you this thing. Everyone's saying, get this bag today, use this supplement tomorrow, right? This is what autopilot means because we are not driving anymore. We are being driven.
What exactly is modern technology doing to our brains?
The short answer is a lot. Technology used to activate just one part of our brain. But then over time, people are adding more features to technology.